Let's take a look at the interface for Serum 2. So this upper section here is the audio signal path, and then this bottom section here is mostly the modulation section. And right at the bottom here, we have some general global controls like the arpeggiator, this clip section, mod wheel, pitch bend, the keyboard with some features related to the keyboard, and some portamento settings over here. Going back to the sound generators, so we have 5 sound generators. We can turn them on individually by clicking over here. So that's the sub oscillator. There are 3 main oscillators, which can be set to any of these 5 different modes. And then lastly, there's the noise generator. All these sound sources can be routed to various places by clicking over here. Then we have the filter section here, and it can be turned on like this. Both the filters can also be routed to different places by clicking and selecting over here. Moving on to the bottom section here, we have macros. So there are 8 macros that we can use to control anything pretty much on the main interface for Serum. We have 4 envelopes here. They're pretty much identical in their controls. Then we're looking at 6 LFOs here, though technically you do get more than 6 LFOs. You get 10 LFOs in total. So if we were to use this last 6th LFO, then you see the remaining 4 LFOs. So talking about that, let's see how to assign an LFO or any of the modulators for that matter. So when I click on LFO 6 here, I see this crosshair. I can click and drag the crosshair on any knob, any parameter, and when I let go, we see this little halo around the knob, and that means the assignment has been made. And now we can see the other 4 LFOs. And then on the right here, we have velocity sensitivity as a modulation source, as well as key tracking, or what they call note here. All right, so that's the oscillator section. And then we have other tabs over here. Let's check out the mix tab. So we see all our sound sources over here, and we can activate them directly over here as well. We are seeing mixer-like controls over here, and these controls are identical to on the main panel. So let's say I bring this volume down here for oscillator B, and now if you go to oscillator B, you can see the level is down. Let's say I pan oscillator A to the right, you will see oscillator A has been panned to the right. The routings can also be set over here. We're seeing the 2 filters as well, and also their routing options. And then we're seeing the 2 buses. So we can route any of these signals to 2 buses over here. And then finally, there's the main section and the direct output. The difference between the main section and the direct output is on the main, we can add the effects. So this effects tab here, I can add effects to the main section and also to the 2 buses. But going back to the mix section, I cannot add any effects to the direct output. So if you want to route any signal, let's say a sub sine wave oscillator, to the speakers directly, to the main output, without it being affected by the filters or by any of the effects processing on the main, you can route it to the direct output. All right, moving on to the effects section, we already looked at that a little bit. So there's this main section here. I can add effects to the main bus. I can add effects to this bus 1, bus 2. We have effects presets. And once you load in an effect by clicking over here, on the effect, clicking over here, we can also see some presets for individual effects. All right, I'm going to get rid of this. Moving on to the matrix section. So here is where we can see all the modulation assignments. So I already made 1 modulation assignment, so I can see the details of it over here. So this is an entire list. I can click over here to see more of this list. So that's the matrix. Then lastly, there's this global section where we have global controls. In Serum 1, you would need to go to the global section because the chaos oscillators were in this global section. But now the chaos oscillators have been incorporated into the LFO section here. So you're only going to the global section to make some global settings change and maybe exploring some of these controls over here. All right, next we have presets. So I can click over here to access all the presets, the factory presets, and specifically the Serum 1 presets are in a separate category. And also your user presets will be over here. Clicking over here, we can access a preset browser. Here we have a more comprehensive view for the presets. You can type in the name of a preset if you know what it is called and look for it. Or you can also access presets by selecting some of these tags. So let's say I'm going to go to the factory section here, drum kit, choir. So these are all the presets that have that particular tag. All right, lastly, there's this drop-down menu over here where we have some general controls. Probably one of the most important one is initializing preset. And also if you are importing an external preset pack, you can do that by clicking over here. All right, so that's a quick look at the overall interface of Serum 2. Let's now take a look at the oscillator section. So we get 3 oscillators, and they're all pretty much identical. You get 5 different modes: wavetable, multi-sample, sample, granular, and spectral. Now, before checking out these individual modes, let's take a look at the common features across all the 3 oscillators. And the one common feature is this pitch control here. So let's take a look at that. And most of these are fairly straightforward. So we have an octave control. So I'm playing middle C here. We can go up 4 octaves or go down 4 octaves. Semitone control. So go up 12 semitones for an octave or down 12 semitones. I'm going to reset that. Fine tune control. So this is in sense. So we go negative 100 and positive 100. And then there's coarse. This goes down to 64 semitones and all the way up to 64 semitones as well. Now, technically coarse tuning and semitone are the same, but what you get is a decimal value. So for example, let me just set this back to 0 here. So with semitones, we get whole number values. We don't get anything in between a whole number value, but with coarse pitch, we get those in between values. So this can be helpful when you have modulation assignment. So for example, if I have an LFO affecting the semitone control, I'm going to reduce the range here a little bit. You can hear the stepping. Whereas if I disable this for a second, bypass, and then assign the same thing to coarse tuning, you get that very smooth modulation effect. Now what's really interesting is that you can have both active, specifically modulation. So right now we just have this active. If I enable this one, you notice that the range has changed. So that's a much narrower range. And then when we activate the coarse modulation, we have that on top of this. If I disable this one, it's a bit hard to hear, but now we're just focusing on coarse modulation. All right, so let me get rid of both. So I'll remove this modulation. I'm going to remove this modulation. So that's the pitch control. Now, another common feature we have across all the oscillators is the routing. So we can route each oscillator either to filter 1 or to filter 2. Right now, both of them are disabled, so we're not hearing any difference. So we can route them to the 2 filters, but we can also route them to the 2 buses. So when I send this to bus 1, we can also check in the mix section here, signal coming in on bus 1. And I can also route it to bus 2. And in the mix section, you can see activity on bus 2. All right, so we'll make use of that more in later part of this course, but that's the routing option for running it through the filter, but yet going into the 2 buses. But we can also choose to just go directly to the main. So now we're skipping the filter and we're directly going to the main, which means that we can still add effects. So you can still add effects to the main bus, but we're skipping the filter. Next option is direct. So in direct, we basically skip everything. The color changes here. And if you go into the effects section, we're not adding any effects to the main. In the mix section here, you can see not the main, but the direct. The direct is basically clean without any processing. So that's direct. And then lastly, we have none. So sometimes you may want to have a oscillator section active, but you do not want to have any output. So right now I'm playing notes on the keyboard. We're not hearing anything because the output is completely disabled. All right, so that's one common thing you get across the 3 oscillators. So pitch control as well as output routing. Now there's another common feature across all the oscillators, and that is unison detuning. Now in wavetable mode, we can see here the unison voices. You can see detune, blend, and further settings over here. In some of the other modes, it might not be so straightforward. So for example, in granular, it seems like it's gone, right? We've lost those controls, but we still have the unison voice here, and we have this gear button to activate those other settings. And over here, we can see detune and blend, right? So you still get all the same controls. They're just in different locations depending on which mode you select. I'm going to preview this or demonstrate this in wavetable mode because we get these bigger knobs over here. So detuning, we need to increase the voices, or for Unison, we need to increase the number of voices. So let's say I set that to 7. You notice that the shading changes, and that's just letting you know that the more voices you stack up, the more CPU is going to be used. The maximum you get is 16 here. So let me set that to 7, let's say. And then now I can choose the amount of detune with the detune control. I've lost signal because this is set to none. Let's set it to the filter. All right, so now we can hear it. So you can get these voices very close to each other in terms of tuning. Pretty much exactly the same tuning. Or you can slowly choose to detune them and get them really out of tune when it's cranked up to the maximum. All right, so that's the amount of Unison detuning for those individual voices. Then there's blend. You notice that there's this center line that represents the original voice. And then we have 3 on either side for a total of 7 voices. So which one do you want to hear louder? You want to hear that center voice louder, then bring the blend down. And of course, when it's all the way to the left, we barely hear the Unison voices. On the other extreme, it's still fairly balanced. You can see that the center voice is just a little bit quieter than the outer voices. All right, so aside from that, we have additional controls over here. So let's click over here to access more controls. Now, we have this width control. Aside from detuning the voices, we're also moving them across the stereo spread. So if I click over here, I can reduce that to 0. So we won't get any stereo width increase. We're just getting the detuning. So everything sounds very mono in this mode. Generally, you want that width, so I'm going to leave it at 100%. Now, there are different Unison modes. So linear is a default, and then there's super. I think this is coming from the old Roland style detuning. And you notice also the distance between the voices in terms of detuning looks a little different. So that's super. If we try exponential, you'll notice a similar effect where the closer voices are close, but the further away voices are further away, if that makes any sense. Right, so just a way to choose how you want to detune those voices. Instead of just having them all equally distant, you can try super, exponential, and inverse is inverse exponential. So you notice how the closer voices are kind of already further away, but the further voices are kind of close to each other. So that could change the sound a little bit. So that's inverse. And then there's random. Random is interesting. As I adjust this knob, you can see how it's just randomly positioning in different places. So you end up with a fixed random value there. All right, so I'm going to set this back to linear. Now this stack parameter is pretty interesting. So right now it's set to off, which essentially means that we're just detuning this based on this knob, and you notice that it gets more and more out of tune, and it gets more and more in tune when the knob is all the way down. So let me leave it somewhere over here, and now let's choose the stack. Now instead of just detuning it, we can specify what tuning we want. So when it's set to 12 1x, check out what happens now with the detune control. I don't know if you hear that, but there's one voice that's an octave above. We still have the detuning, but they have one voice an octave above. Now we've lost it. We have that octave above. We can get 2 times that. You can hear it's much more obvious now because it's 2 octaves above. And we still have the detuning effect. 3 octaves. Right? And also that higher pitched octave 3 times transpose voice is also being detuned. Now, aside from the octaves, we also have octave and fifth. So plus 7 is 7 semitones above, so that creates a fifth interval. So octave and fifth, and that's octave fifth times 2. And then, probably guess it, 3 times. All right, so those are all the octave and fifths. Then we have center negative 12. So that basically means that the center voice is an octave below. And this sounds pretty nice. So you get this nice richness in the sound, but also some low end because of that one voice being an octave below. And you can have it 2 octaves below. You got to be careful with this because that's going to get quite low at 2 octaves below. All right, I'm going to set this back to off. So now we know how mode works, we know how stack works, we've looked at width, range. So when I'm adjusting this detuning, we have a range of 0 to 2 semitones, right? That's the default. But you can change that. You can even set it to 0, which doesn't make any sense, right? So nothing's happening now. So we can go all the way up to 48 semitones. So check this out now. Some pretty wild. And if I set one of these options, let's try the widest one here. I wish it was more in tune at the highest value. You can hear it's still a bit out of tune here. This sounds more in tune here at 0.79. But yeah, you can create some fun sci-fi effects with that range control. All right, I'm going to set it back to 2, which is the default. Now, wavetable position, warp 1, warp 2. We get wavetable position only in the wavetable mode. So if I choose, let's say, sample mode and go into the settings here, there's no wavetable option. So it switches to start and span. So let's go back to wavetable and talk about this. Now, a wavetable means that we have a table of different waveforms in this one particular table. So in my Unison settings, I can basically adjust that. So instead of all voices being the same waveform that we have here, so in this case, let's say, what was this? Sawtooth waveform. I can choose to spread that as well. So when I increase this, not only are we unison detuning, we're also adjusting the wavetable position for those different voices. And the same applies to warp. So we have 2 warp modes here. So instead of just having every voice with the same warp setting, you can basically change the warp setting for each. I obviously don't have warping here, but let's just pick something like a distortion warp, like hard clip. In fact, you're already hearing this. As I'm increasing it, only certain voices are changing in terms of adding that distortion. So negative value just means it's going to inverse it, so the values are going to go backwards, as opposed to in the positive. Yeah, some of this can be a little hard to hear, but just be aware that wavetable position, warp 1 and warp 2 can change per voice if you have Unison setting set up. All right, so that's for wavetable. Now in sample and granular, we notice a different setting here. So there's start and span. So let me just load in a sample. Let's pick whatever. Let's say this bass sound and play a little bit higher. Let's turn off that hard clipping. Let's get rid of it completely. So we have Unison on, so we have 7 voices, some detune, some blend. I can go in here now and adjust the start offset for those 7 voices. So this is randomly going to change the start position in a very subtle way. So each of the 7 voices are not all going to start at the same phase. So that's start position randomization. Now span is interesting. Span does the same thing, but in a fixed position. But again, can be very, very subtle. Now, one odd thing I've noticed that you also have negative values for span. And then what ends up happening is that we just lose one channel entirely. So right now I'm just hearing the right channel. We hear the left channel for a brief moment, and then we just only hear the right channel. So I'm not sure what negative span means, because if you take a look at the waveform, like this is the start position, you can't go any further left. I mean, I guess you can come down here. Let's see if that makes any difference. Yeah, we're still completely losing one channel. So it might be a bug, I'm not 100% sure, but just be aware that that is essentially span, where we're adjusting the start position for your 7 voices, or how many ever Unison voices you have. And then start is randomizing it. So every time you play, you'll get a different start position for those 7 voices. We still have the warp options here, exactly the same thing. And that's basically it. So if I switch over to granular mode, you'll notice we have that same start and span. Switch to spectral mode, click over here. We have all the same stuff. All right, so those are all the Unison settings. And as we've discovered, we have Unison for all the different oscillator modes. Now there's some other common controls across the 3 oscillators, and that's in this right-click menu over here. First one here is reset control. Now this is just an on-off switch. So let's say the oscillator is off, I can right-click here and reset control and it'll turn back on. Now, that's not very helpful, but let's say a knob is set to a specific position. You can right-click and then reset control, and that will set it back to the default. And you can also command-click to reset it back to the default setting. All right, so reset control, MIDI learn. This is also a little odd, but essentially you can MIDI learn the on-off feature for an oscillator. So I'm basically turning on and turning off this oscillator now with a MIDI controller. And if you right-click here, you can see which CC it is, and of course you can remove it as well. Again, makes more sense on a knob. So if I MIDI learn this knob, and now I can control that with my external MIDI controller. Let's remove that as well. All right, right-click here, we've seen MIDI learn. There's also lock module. So let's say I'm going to just pick some waveform here, and I'm just going to add something in here, add something in here. I guess we need to add something in here. We need to talk about this. We'll get to this later on when we take a look at the spectral mode. But I've essentially added a filter here. All right, so I've done some stuff to this particular oscillator, and now I can lock this. What does that mean? I can still make changes, so it's not locked in that sense, but it's locked in the sense that when I load in a different preset, so let's say I switch to a different preset, notice that this oscillator does not change. Everything else has changed, but the oscillator stays locked in. So that can be helpful. All right, I'm going to initialize this preset. And when you initialize, it does reset whatever was locked as well. All right, so that's lock module. Now, lock module is for an entire module, but you can also lock a specific control. So I can lock this parameter. Actually, let me unlock this. It's a weird parameter to lock. Let's say wavetable position. In this particular position, I'm going to right-click and lock parameter. And now when I load in presets, you'll notice that that position is locked, but the wavetable itself has changed. All right, initialize this again. Other options we have here that are common. Initializing the module, so that just resets everything back to default, and this is the default, so nothing really changed here. Copy. So I can copy the settings of this. So again, let me change this, choose a different wavetable, change the position, detune, blend, panning. So now I'll right-click here, copy, and I can right-click here and paste. So we have the exact same settings. You can also hold down Option and drag. Let's say on oscillator 3 here, and I've copied that over. If you just drag without holding down Option, what ends up happening is that you end up swapping the position. So that's interesting. So that's copying. There's also copy with mods. So if I assign some modulation, again, just randomly assigning modulation here. So now when I right-click and copy, and then I right-click here and I paste with mods, all the settings should have been pasted with the mods, but I don't see that change happening here. So again, let's double check. So this is the oscillator set to wavetable mode. I have some modulation assigned here. And now I'm going to right-click here and copy with mods. And let's actually initialize this first, initialize the module, and then right-click here and I'll select paste. Oh, there you go. Yeah, maybe I just did something wrong. All right, so that's the copy-paste option. And then lastly, there's enable pitch tracking. So right now, if I play this sound, let me set the pan back in the center. So we are hearing this particular sound and it's tracking the pitch from the keyboard, but I can disable that. We're hearing the modulation, but we're not hearing any pitch change on this particular oscillator. So that's enable pitch tracking. And like I said, you have this across all the oscillators. Alright, so those are all the common features we get across the 3 oscillators.